gas. It was on the dusty eastern edge of El Paso, Texas, when the O'Byrne family finally stopped to fill up the car. The Oldsmobile had been sucking fumes for the last 50 miles, and everyone but Chester feared they were going to run out of gas. It was almost noon on a July day in 1964, and there were still about 400 miles until they got to Abilene. The temperature was over 100 degrees, with humidity around 98%. Chester had turned off the air conditioner about an hour earlier to conserve fuel. The mood for Anna and the three children, John, Paul, and Mark, was that someone had died and they were all about to face the same fate. Sweat flowed without pause, and whatever skin touched the upholstery had to be unpeeled frequently to prevent burns and rashes. When they crossed the border into Texas, Anna announced, "We are now entering hell." Chester was annoyed with his wife's comment, but he knew it could not be persuasively argued under the conditions, so he clenched his jaw and let it go. They began passing gas stations as they approached El Paso. Everyone thought Dad must have been concentrating on the road and just missed them. No one said anything until they passed another row of service stations. Chester was barreling down the highway with no apparent intention of stopping. The mood in the car was tense. Anna intended to remind her husband of the gas crisis and that everyone needed to use the restroom, but what came out of her mouth was, "God, I hate this place." Dad exploded. "Now that's enough of that. I want y'all to keep quiet right now." They didn't need a second invitation. Not another squeak did they make. Remarkably, the need to use the restroom reduced by at least half for all but 7-year-old Mark O'Byrne. Mark was approaching critical mass. He hadn't pooped in 3 days, and his diet consisted mostly of grilled cheese sandwiches due to his mother's insistence that this dish was the one thing they couldn't ruin in coffee shops on the road. No fruit or water was in the car, just a fresh stick of gum at the start of each day's drive. It felt like there was a tire in his tummy, and even at a young age, he knew it wouldn't be easy once he reached a bowl. But first, Mark needed to reach a bowl. Since potty training, he had been required to spend time atop the throne every morning after breakfast until he produced something. His mother told him this would make him regular. But the last several traveling days hadn't provided him with the time or opportunity to do his normal duty. This was confusing, and the lack of fruit, water, or activity during the drive wore him down. Anna told him as soon as they reached the new house, he could sit for as long as he pleased, because he'd have his own bathroom, and that, she added, might be the only good thing about the whole move. They weren't arriving at the new house in Dallas until the next afternoon. Waiting until then was not an option. Waiting until they got to a motel in Abilene was not an option. Clearly, over the din of wind through the windows and country music on the radio that only Mark and Chester seemed to enjoy, Mark announced, "Daddy, I gotta poop." This awoke Chester from his funk. He had sprinted through El Paso with single-minded determination. The sooner they finished this trip, he thought, the sooner they could get to his new job with the Dallas Cowboys and put all this behind. When Mark made his declaration, the landscape was returning to that which is most typical of Texas. Miles and miles of nothing but miles and miles. For the first time in about an hour, Chester glanced at the gas meter. The red stick pressed so hard against the empty side it was threatening to turn blue. How they were still going was amazing to him, and Chester's admiration for Oldsmobile reached a new plateau. Mercifully, a filling station materialized from the mirages and dust to their right. Chester took his foot off the accelerator, and they coasted to a halt by the single pump. As soon as the Oldsmobile came to a complete stop, Mark leaned over Paul, unlocked the back door, climbed clumsily over his brother, and ran toward the small building that housed an office, garage, and hopefully commode. He saw a man in a dirty jumpsuit and hat emerge from the office, and Mark yelled, "Hi, mister, where's the bathroom?" The man smiled and pointed toward the garage. The gaps in his teeth and the huge, cavernous black vacuum behind them momentarily distracted Mark, but he quickly resumed his sprint in the direction the man pointed. Behind the office, against the far right wall of the garage, was a solitary door with no markings other than smudge and grease. When he reached and then opened the door, he was greeted with a room shinier and whiter than anything he'd seen since leaving home. His brothers would later say that bathroom hurt their eyes, but not Mark. This was one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen. He relaxed and surveyed the surroundings, smiling because he couldn't help himself, all the while relishing the faint, though unmistakable scent of Mr. Clean. Everything was pure white, save for a mirror hanging over the sink and two framed items on the wall just to the right. In one, pressed without wrinkle, rested an American flag. Inside the other was a sewn and embroidered landscape featuring a house inside a white picket fence with smoke coming out of the chimney and animals in the front yard. There was a dog, a cat, a horse, a cow, a duck, a pig, and 3 sheep. They were all smiling. Above the scene were inscribed the words, "Clean is good." These words meant nothing more to Mark than clean was good, and that was fine because clean meant his mother. Thinking of his mother reminded him it was time to do his duty. Except he didn't need to go anymore. He didn't even need to pee. This couldn't be possible, of course, because only minutes before he felt he might poop a rib. There was a knock at the door. It was his brothers. They needed to go now. Mark told them he was still trying. "Don't try," 17-year-old John yelled. "Do your duty." "Yeah, do it or get out," 14-year-old Paul added, laughing. "We gotta go." The pressure could have been disastrous, except Mark didn't feel any pressure. In fact, he was completely relieved. Something about that room and the pure white clean, and clean was good. And he didn't need to go. This was risky, and he knew it, and he wasn't sure what to do. "Come on," yelled John. Then in a moment of reason and compromise, he suggested, "Look, if you don't have to go now, try again when everyone else is done." Fair enough, Mark thought, regretfully moving toward the door. He really didn't want to leave that room. Any comments his brothers were about to make dissolved to painful cries of "Ow!" as Mark walked outside and exposed his brothers to pure, clean truth. They shielded their eyes, entered, and closed the door. Immediately, the pain in his intestines returned, and Mark walked almost doubled over to the edge of the garage and sat outside the wall of the office. He watched Anna and Chester standing at the edge of the service station under the sign that said gas. Anna was making no attempt to hide her tears, and Chester held his right hand firmly on her left shoulder as he spoke in tones and words only the two of them would ever know. The O'Byrne family was moving from San Francisco to Dallas. When Anna and Chester left their home state of Arkansas 20 years earlier, she swore she would only go back to the South for funerals. Until that very day, she made good on the declaration. In the weeks leading up to the move, Mark overheard Anna tell friends and neighbors she was going to another funeral, her own. So this was hell. "How-do?" It was the man in the coveralls. He emerged from his office, walking into the sunlight just past the edge of the garage. He smiled at Mark and repeated, "How-do, little boy, how-do? My name's Al. What's yours?" "I need to poop," moaned Mark, while staring at a pattern of teeth and shadow he would attempt to carve every Halloween for the rest of his life. You don't say, laughed Al. Where are y'all from? California, Mark responded and clutched his sides. Well, I heard people get named funny out there, Al remarked, but Mark gave no sign of getting his own joke. He squatted down to Mark's level, removed his hat, and wiped his head with a greasy cloth from one of the many pockets of his coveralls. So then, y'all just got to Texas? Something in Al's voice was soothing, and Mark nodded. So then, y'all haven't had a proper introduction to Texas, have you? Mark looked toward his parents, who hadn't changed positions or roles. He said, well, we got introduced, but I don't know if it was proper. Al stood up and smiled broadly. Well then, let me be the first. You say you got a poop? Stay right there. Mark had no intention of moving, and if his parents had said the trip was over, he would have been content to stay. He wanted to get back in that bathroom because he didn't hurt in there, and clean was good. His brothers were still in there. Al returned holding a tall glass bottle. On the center of the bottle, in red letters, it said, Dr. Pepper. He extended the bottle to Mark and announced, welcome to Texas, little boy. This will cure whatever ails you. Mark grabbed the bottle with icy condensation running down the side and drank deeply of the bubbling brown content. Oh man, this was better than cartoons or women's dressing rooms. Nothing in his life ever tasted like that again. Prunes, cherries, molasses, gravy, and bubbles, icy cold in a stylish glass bottle, with a kick carrying from the throat to the nose to the ears to the head, and then down to the tummy like paratroopers with orders to bivouac. Al had made a friend for life. Mark drank almost half the bottle before he remembered his manners. Thank you, sir, he finally gasped as the inside of his nose felt like it grew hair that turned into ice and then broke off. Al glanced toward Mark's parents and then remarked reassuringly, well, boy, looks like your life's a little messy right now. I got a boy a little older than you, and I know all about these kinds of things. It might get a whole lot messier before it's over. He paused to watch the boy gulping at the Dr. Pepper. Al smiled and added, especially if you keep gulping that pepper. Whoa, boy, slow down. That stuff will go right through you. Mark didn't exactly lose his stomach ache, but somehow the mass found a little more room to swim around and disperse. He burped for about 10 seconds. There was a brief pause, and then he and Al shared the laugh of friends, pure and clean like they'd known each other all their lives. It was Anna approaching who broke the moment with a gentle reminder. What do you say when you burp? Excuse me, sir, Mark stated properly, though smiling all the while. Al nodded his head and praised. That's mighty fine, boy. Your mama's taught you well. She nodded her head in appreciation and then asked, did you go to the bathroom? Yes, Mom, and you should too. Mama, that bathroom is the most beautiful. I'm sure it is, sweetheart. Maybe some other time. We're going back to El Paso for the rest of the day and check into a motel. She glanced doubtfully toward the grungy garage and stared in amazement behind her shades at Al's teeth. She thought, God-forsaken hell, I'm in Texas. She blushed with guilt and swore to confess her sins as soon as they found a Catholic church close to their new home in Dallas. John and Paul sprinted by them in a race to the car. Anna faced Al and told him with appreciation, thank you, sir, for being so kind to our youngest boy. God bless you and all yours. Al tipped his cap. They noticed it said Al on it, and Mark thought that was handy in case he ever forgot his name. He looked like someone who might. Anna headed for the car and motioned for Mark to follow. Before he did, he thought of asking Al for another Dr. Pepper, but instead he asked, "Why is your bathroom so clean?" Al seemed slightly surprised by the question because this boy was obviously from a good family with a real mom. Then he remembered this was just a little boy who needed to poop. Al said, so Mark would never forget, "That's your throne, boy. The throne. The throne of Almighty. You gotta keep the throne clean. You're in Texas now. Clean is good." Mark nodded his head, because he really did understand. He felt deep gratitude to this strange-looking man and wanted to give him something in return. They shook hands. Mark tried looking at his face, but quickly closed his eyes and shielded them from the radiant sun shining pure and bright over the head of Almighty. In a sudden and electrifying moment, a surge of energy passed between the two, and Mark knew several things about his new friend. Al was the son of his father and his sister, who also happened to be the mother of his boy. On a scale of 1 to 10 for inbreeds, Al rated about a 6. It would have been 8 or 9, except for his teeth. He'd never grown more than several, and by that time was down to a mere few. Gas was the family business, and Al had inherited it when 13 of his clan ate some bad pork one evening at supper and died. The only survivors were Al, his son, and his sister, who was away visiting family in Fort Worth. Al and his son shared a pot of beans at lunch that day and didn't like feeling too full, so they passed on supper. While the rest of the family ate and died, Al's son hunted snakes in the vast desert behind gas. Al did some cleanup work in the office and then sat a while with his feet on the desk, occasionally dozing as he watched the cars roll by on Highway 10. About an hour later, his boy came along, and father and son played checkers and drank sodas until dark. They closed and locked the office, did a quick once-over of the restroom, inside the garage, and then walked to their home about 75 yards to the desert and surrounded by a white picket fence. Father and son went inside the house together and made the grisly discovery. Mark had no idea how it was he knew these things, and he wasn't even sure what some of them meant, but know them he did, and he was touched. Mark squinted at Al and said, "I'm sorry about your family." Al looked like he'd had his hand stuck in an electrical socket, but as soon as Mark spoke, he wavered slightly on his feet and appeared genuinely stunned at what Mark seemed to know. Finally he asked, "Dear Lord, can you see things?" Mark was a little confused by the question, but he replied, "Sure, I see things, mister. I mean, I see you, and I saw your bathroom. I know clean is good." When their clasp finally broke, Mark wished to repay this kind Texan with a gift, so he offered him the truth. "Thank you, Mr. Mighty, for the drink and the kind how-do. I hope you get your teeth fixed, or no one's going to talk with you." Mark turned and skipped to the car. He used to love making rhymes in his old home. When they drove away from gas, Mark watched out the back window as Almighty wrote something on his wrist. He wondered if Al was writing his poem, or maybe it was his own name again, in case he couldn't find his hat. The O'Byrne family went to El Paso, and while John and Paul played in the new swimming pool there, Mark stayed in the motel bathroom and did his duty while reading the Gideon Bible. He was in there for 2 uninterrupted hours before emerging a wiser and lighter boy. That night, they ate real good Mexican food, and Mark drank another Dr. Pepper. It seemed to Mark that hell might not